And so in the name of code switching, stay woke. I am delighted that I am part of the distinguished panel who showed their vulnerabilities and who shared what their experiences have been and the kinds of things they navigate. And particularly talking about the patient experience and what happens when some of us walk in the room and the patient says, I don't want anyone like you touching me or caring for me, with the implicit belief that you're not as well prepared, you're not as smart, you're not as educated. And so these are real world experiences, and while I heard a lot of discussion earlier about the head and the heart, there is another word other than love that we don't talk a lot about, and that's forgiveness. And so I want to put that out there because it also requires some level of forgiveness repetitively to keep going back into these environments and facing these kinds of challenges in a day when you think they've gone away or they should have gone away. And yet they show up, and they show up very loudly. They show up differently than sometimes earlier before, and then sometimes they show up the way they've always shown up. And so this becomes part of the stress of having to navigate that in addition to everything else that one must juggle, be it the many forms of intersectionality or the ways in which we see ourselves, and the labels that we put on each other. Even interprofessionally, the label, if you carry a certain label, nurse, doctor, it may very well give people some other thoughts or some other ideas. So now we'd like to hear from you. We've got a few minutes, and we recognize that we are between you and lunch. But we do need to give you, I'm sure the panelists have provoked some thoughts, and we'd love to entertain a few questions. Yes.
My name is Dr. Paula Nez, and I have a comment about what I just heard.
Yes.
Being a practicing dentist for 28 years, I've experienced both of the sexism and the racism that you're speaking of. And at age 61, I have decided that when I see something, I'm going to say something. And I've learned to call a thing a thing.
Yes.
Okay? And I don't have a problem at all going to the EEOC because that is what it's for. But I do want to say that when you do see something and say something, when you go to the EEOC, let them know that you said, I experienced sexism, I experienced racism, and let them know that you told your organizational body that before you go. Because there are rules that say, well, you can say that you were harassed, but did you say you were harassed because you are a woman? Or did you say you were harassed because you are African American? You have to call a thing in order to get this out of our communities and get it out of our environments and get it out of our work environment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Microphone to my right.
Hi, I'm Alfred Sadler. I'm an internist. I'm also, what was the term I think you used? Longitudinally.
Chronologically gifted.
Chronologically gifted.
Not longitudinal.
I'm not a pre-medical student. I just thought it was very profound that what all of you were talking about that could be applied not just to the issues that you were talking about, but the previous group, and talking about the patient being in the center versus the patient and the physician being in the center and playing with that. I always had problems with patient satisfaction surveys because I always thought there were so many other things, how they liked the waiting room, lots of other things could affect how somebody would say they were satisfied. And I think that if you think about the biases that several of you have mentioned, I think all of you mentioned about, I don't like that doctor, or I don't like her or him or it, we realize that a lot of the patient satisfaction surveys are biased negatively related to that. That in turn contributes to patient dissatisfaction, physician dissatisfaction, and it also contributes to looking at the data and saying, well, I'm going to throw that all out. It really doesn't mean much. So maybe your other group might want to incorporate some of the issues that you're bringing up here into that. I know your life's complicated enough trying to keep this simple, but that really hit me right between the forehead, so I had to get it off my chest. Thank you.
Great point. Yes.
Thank you. My name's David. I'm referencing some of our Oxford current modules with the surgeons there, looking at best practices specific to mentoring and having a distinction between coaching and mentoring in terms of a journey, a professional journey. And it's also related to our work at IHS here in the States and with Walter Reed, because it's looking at navigating some of the problems intentionally, very deliberately, in terms of saying, the first week you'll experience this, the third week this, the 10th week this, we're going to watch you for this. And it was a different way of shaping the person and grooming the person. And my question to Dr. Templeton and Dr. Mitchell is, I noticed in the Knowledge Hub that we have that although we mention mentoring, is it possible to consider ways in which you could also contribute to the mentoring CMEs in terms of having deliberate medical education modules for orientation and for PGY1s, in which they are guided, they're encouraged, they see stories. There is deliberate ways of saying, when you encounter this. An example is, at a recent conference we had, a marvelous physician stood on stage and she said, at age 65, she remembers her very first day as a resident. And her patient passed at 1 o'clock, and she got some coffee and came back just 7 minutes later, and there's a new person in the bed. And the senior attending said, get over it, it's a business. She said that statement to her affected her for 40 years, literally, that first day. And so I submit that as we are caring for the patient, we also are caring for our resident. There's an ethical, moral decision-making in which we have a duty of care, and we are negligent when we don't invest into next generation and hand that baton. And so we mentioned love, but in that there is a journeying with and not just saying figure it out, okay? And so there's a Harvard Cole model that we work with and cognitive mediation, and so I ask, can we be very deliberate in our mentoring approach? Thank you.
I appreciate your comments, and I agree, whether we call it mentoring or advising or whatever we would like to call it. I think it needs to be very deliberate. If you look at gender-based differences, male physicians are more likely to get their support with their colleagues or others at work. Women tend to turn to family members and friends. And that's fine, but the family members and friends don't understand the politics of working in a healthcare environment. So whether that's they feel excluded and don't know how to access those resources, those advising resources aren't available, they don't know how to avail them. But I think having, as you said, a very deliberate advising or mentoring process available. You don't want to mandate this, but at least strongly encourage that women participate in this. And I would even go back to the medical students, because they also need to learn how to navigate. Because you then can talk to someone about when there's an adverse patient event, how do you deal with that? We know that, again, that women tend to respond and cope by going into self-blame, which may be part of the issue with burnout. Well, can you talk with someone about other ways of coping other than blaming yourself? And if you did have some role in whatever the outcome was, then what can you do differently? And if you didn't, then give it up and move on. As well as I mentioned, talking to someone about how you navigate the work-life balance or the work-life integration. I don't see a need for every physician, especially every female physician who comes along, to reinvent the wheel. Some people have figured this out. Why not put those two people together? And that will also give them work on the loneliness issue that we talked about, give them someone with whom they can communicate and work through some of these issues.
Yes, thank you. And Dr. Mitchell, I was wanting to ask, there are just beginning a sequence of blogs that actually stemmed from our American Indian community of walking in both worlds, and where the voice was shared, the voice was encouraged. And so we actually found incredible positive outcomes from the dual journey. I wanted to ask, have you had a chance to mentor others there in Nashville?
Yes. That is something, so as junior faculty, I just finished residency 2 years ago, and that has kind of been one of my non-funded projects, is finding these folks, specifically in internal medicine and pediatrics, where I'm kind of housed, that need some help, that are able to reach out, and even those who aren't reaching out, I'm kind of poking them a little bit to see if they're willing to accept help. Just because we know the mentor group is really, really small. The pool is really small. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
We'll take the last 3 questions, and then we'll need to end. Yes.
Hi, my name is Riki Eco. I'm here from the American Psychiatric Association. I wanted to say thank you so much to all of you for sharing your experiences. And my question is kind of based off of mentoring a little bit again. So we've been looking a little bit at burnout and well-being at the American Psychiatric Association, and some of the studies that we've found that there hasn't been a lot of research done on how race and ethnicity plays a part in burnout, but there has been some for medical students. And I was just wondering whether you guys could speak to any mentors that you may have had while you were coming through your practice, because what we found is that the people who had closer communities, who had really good mentors, found a more sense of inclusiveness and were able to kind of withstand burnout much better than their peers.
Very quickly, I can tell you that some of my best mentors don't work at the same place that I do, because there's a real vulnerability when you're honest and you build trust with mentors. And despite you having shared experience of being of a minority group, where you work, it's very, very challenging to navigate some of those politics. And so having people that you trust who are outside of that organization, who you know aren't involved in the day-to-day politics, I think makes a huge difference. But what you mentioned around residents and students is really important, because a lot of our attention does focus on these experiences of our learners, but we don't talk about the experience of our faculty. So how do we expect faculty to mentor our learners when we don't give our faculty permission to talk about and reflect on their own experiences of discrimination and prejudice in the workplace?
I'm just going to add to that remember, most of us need more than one mentor. There's no one mentor that can meet all of your needs. And so you will need multiple mentors to deal with different aspects of what you're dealing with. So expand that cadre of mentors, and those who will have nothing but your best interest at heart and will tell you, even the hard conversation is because they care about you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Jeremy Nobel from the Unlonely Project and Harvard Medical School. First, terrific that this topic is on the panel. You know, what you're talking about in inclusion diversity actually is a very particular kind of loneliness. It's a social loneliness. Sometimes it's called ethical loneliness. It's become, there's a literature growing about it. And it's really the kind of loneliness you have when you go into a room and your arrival is not anticipated or unwanted. There's no seat for you around the table. And one of the challenges, because we all agree that talking more about it will help, is there is a stigma about talking about it. It feels self-serving. It acknowledges a kind of, or the risk is that it acknowledges a kind of guilt or shame. All that notwithstanding, do you think there's an opportunity to use the power of creative expression to invite people to share their particular stories around this kind of social loneliness, this exclusion, in a way that they can feel better connected to other people dealing with it? And then how do we get started, if that's important?
It does require courageous dialogue, I like to call it, or courageous conversation, and the ability to risk putting light on the subject. It's the only way to get at the heart of it. And so encouraging the storytelling and the sharing and making it safe environments to tell those stories is going to be very key. to doing this work.
Good.
That's something that I've seen with the project that we're working on with senior female physicians, and we're defined by Dr. Walling, who is one and not me, because we were touchy on what we were going to call this. But this is looking at women physicians who are 60 and older. So it came from a time when there were very few women that were going through medical school and residency, let alone in practice. And so these women were lonely. And I went into initially with a focus group with my set of 15 questions, and we made it through maybe 3, because they did all want to tell their stories, and very, very rich stories of what they had experienced.
Great. Thank you.
And our last question.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Alexandra May. I'm a new registered nurse and president of New Jersey Nursing Students. So the goal of our organization is to connect students with different networking opportunities and professionals. And I realized that my experience from University of Maryland was completely different than nursing school, definitely more challenging. And I encountered many nursing students who were outside that typical 17 to 26 age range. So you have students who are working moms and dads. They're either older, they have kids, so their stories were kind of different in what they experienced, but we did have a similar feeling of sometimes clinical burnout with exams and tests. So when trying to figure out this issue, my question to you guys is, how did you guys have quality conversation around this to incorporate all the age groups, whether it's men, women, Black, white, Asian, to be able to talk about it and have a conversation where they can say what's bothering them and effectively create change later, so they can talk about their experiences and don't necessarily bring that into their workplace when they do start working. Because I know sometimes as we start out as new nurses, what our foundation now is how we handle situations in the future. So do you have any suggestions on how to have that conversation to help people express their feelings in a safe environment at different nursing schools or schools in general, so they don't carry negative experiences with them and have a chance to kind of put it out there and really digest what's going on and maybe bounce back ideas off of other people on how to handle that situation?
I can quickly tell you that I'm involved with a study right now where we've been working with nursing students on understanding compassionate curricula and whether self-disclosure is taught in existing curricula. And it's fascinating because there's not one answer to your question. I think everybody experiences things differently, just like you mentioned. So there were people who believe that there isn't something about that you can teach in a classroom or through didactic teaching. It's all about the experiences in the clinical learning environment. But then there's such a variability in terms of those experiences within that environment. What you also really poignantly captured was the fact that these kinds of differences that we're talking about today, they're not always obvious differences. They can be interprofessional biases and stereotypes. They can be age-related biases and stereotypes. And we know from the literature that the best way to address this is to see each other as unique human beings, not as labels, not as this person or that person, but to learn from each other, particularly people who have personal histories that are different from our own, who challenge us to think differently, and who challenge us to be better. So we have to seek those conversations, and leadership has to foster the kind of environment where those conversations can occur without stifling it.
Thank you.
Welcome. Please join me in thanking the panelists.